It seems we have an imposter in our midst.
Is Eddie's mouth dry? Not even a cactus would flourish there. He's vaguely aware of Gwent rising from his seat and starting to pace behind him.
The question is, booms Gwent, can we practically apply the guidelines Charles here has set out for us?
Somehow Eddie is supposed to break this silence. Unfortunately, his mouth is drier than a constipated camel's sphincter. Somebody saves him. It's his travelling companion from the shuttle, the honest featured fellow in the dog collar.
I think it's a little brutal, Gwent, to be hoisting this onto Mr. Gordon's shoulders.
I think not, Padre. The scientific Miss Peck. After all, it is rather a brutal penalty, and after all, it was Mr. Gordon who recommended it. We need to know if he still believes it to be viable.
I'm sorry, pipes a voice that clearly isn't. What exactly is the penalty we're discussing?
Eddie looks over at the speaker. It's a square-jawed crew cut of a man built big. Eddie wonders how you get muscles like that. Someone snaps, "Oh, come on, Mr. Sticks, it's in the book." And he indicates several bound volumes in the centre of the table.
Charles,
asks Gwent from behind his shoulder,
perhaps you'd like to illuminate our security section leader as to the recommended remedial procedure in the event of unselected personnel impersonating one of the selected.
There can be no escape now. The jig is most definitely up. An uncommon anger wells up in Eddie's tired, beleaguered spirit. He's had enough. All right. You've all had your juvenile fun. Just let me say this. I may not be the brightest guy on board, but you are not better than me. None of you. Not one of you is actually any better a person than I am. Eddie senses, from the slightly stunned, open-jawed reaction around the table, that he has somehow missed the mark. Like a crossbow bolt in his overworked, distended gut, it hits him. He is not the imposter they're discussing. Gwent had been referring to another imposter, one who isn't even in the room. Eddie tries to find somewhere to look, but there's nowhere. He can feel the entire committee squirming.
Charles!
Gwent claps a fatherly hand on Eddie's shoulder, almost snapping it.
You're absolutely right. We all accepted your formulae. There was ample opportunity for debate, and now is not the time to call you to task.
He turns and addresses the muscle man.
The penalty, Mr. Sticks, is the same penalty inflicted on all perpetrators of, and I quote, non-correctable and mission-threatening transgressions of ship's regulations.
He smiles politely at Eddie, acknowledging Charles Gordon's wording.
To wit, the non-permanent suspension of life.
The non-permanent suspension of life? That doesn't sound good to Eddie. That doesn't sound like something a person might look forward to should a person ever be exposed as a ship regulation transgressor of mission-threatening proportions.
The non-permanent suspension of life, repeats the Padre. A nice phrase, concealing a rather barbaric reality.
Let me assure everyone that the procedure is painless and extremely efficient. Clearly a doctor talking. A small child could perform the deed with only an ether-soaked handkerchief and a circular saw. A circular saw? Eddie's right to worry.
I think we can trust Dr. Morton's skills, booms Gwent. Piers, you and your team have our fullest confidence.
Father Lewis, who seems to be the closest thing to a human being on board, jumps in.
But we don't know anything about the perpetrator. Have we assessed his potential? He may have some valuable contribution to make to the community.
Gwent is back at the head of the table.
2 points, Padre. He is not among the selected, and, balm for your conscience, the man's a career criminal. He's resorted on several occasions to spree murdering as an anti-boredom device. Now he's responsible for the premature demise of the selected community member he's currently impersonating. We can hardly risk contaminating our gene pool with this son of Cain, now can we? So, what alternative do we have?
Couldn't we? Eddie feels invisible bolts strike him from every eye in the room. Everyone's waiting for another paranoid outburst. I mean, it sounds too obvious to suggest, but couldn't we send him back down? Gwent rolls his eyes.
No, Charles, we're off. We're en route. We're officially launched over 7 minutes ago.
They're off? The ship has set out from Earth's orbit, bound for the stars, on the most ambitious journey ever undertaken by the human race? And this historic event has passed unmarked by so much as an announcement?
Forgot to warn you, we thought it best to slip away early without the old media brouhaha.
Eddie says, I see. Makes sense. But it doesn't. Embarking on a momentous journey without waving goodbye to everything you're leaving behind, that feels wrong. Well, if you'll excuse me, I've got a lot of ship to see. There's only one part of the ship Eddie has any intention of examining at the moment, the ceiling above his pillow. But the day's ordeals are not yet done. Gwent wants Eddie to watch the operation with him.
I think we both should be there, Charles, don't you?
The circular saw-type operation performed by Dr. Piers Morton and his team, with probably generous amounts of gore. Eddie's face must be broadcasting his queasiness.
I'm not exactly relishing the prospect myself, Charles. In crude terms, Piers will be taking a human being and removing his head and spinal column from the rest of his body.
The rest of the sentence is lost on Eddie. A nightmarish quality of matter-of-factness sharply counterpoints the horror that's about to be performed. There's the high-tech, impersonal cleanliness of the operating theatre and the overstated comfort of the observation gallery looking down on it where Eddie is sitting, waiting for the show to begin. Leather seats with fold-away tables and, incredibly, cup holders on the arms. One small blessing. He's managed to position himself a good way from Gwent, who's holding court in what must be the equivalent of the royal box. He keeps beckoning for Eddie to come over and join him, but so far he's managed not to notice. Somebody sits down next to Eddie. It's the priest, Father Lewis. Eddie nods a greeting. The priest doesn't nod back. After a while he says, "This is, don't you think, ever so slightly barbaric?" Of course it is. Eddie wants to agree with Lewis, but as C.P. Gordon, he can't. Eddie is rescued from this potentially excruciating interchange by a hubbub behind them. The security chief with the muscles, Styx, is in conversation with an angry-looking Gwent. Finally, Gwent gestures with his head and Styx hurries off.
"Ladies and gentlemen," says Gwent, "the procedure has been postponed. Our intended subject has made himself temporarily unavailable. He will, of course, be invited back immediately we discover his whereabouts."
Eddie looks over at Lewis. The man's escaped. Good.
"It must be made known. This individual is capable of extreme violence. He accounted for the lives of no less than 5 of Mr. Stick's security team, and he made assertions that he fully intends to kill again. You should all be familiar with his visage."
Gwent nods at the overhead screen. Eddie turns his head. It's the face of Mr. Pinksocks. Eddie's in one of the ship's many restaurants. He's close to exhaustion, but he daren't go back to his apartment. He wants to stay in public, in as much public as possible, until he knows for certain Mr. Pinksocks is safely back under lock and key. He's trying to take his mind off his many woes by working through Gordon's papers, but that isn't helping anything. The more he reads, the more he becomes convinced the man's a borderline fascist. There are, for instance, an enormous number of detailed prescriptions for who should be permitted to mate with whom, and when. Shagging laws. And not just for this generation, for all future generations too. This is supposedly to keep the gene pool in good order, but it sounds awfully close to racial purity programs to Eddie. There's worse. All the positions on board are not merely held for life. They're held down the family line. Children have their jobs allocated before birth, and their children will be born to replace them, and their children will follow. The idea here is to obviate destructive and wasteful competitiveness. For Eddie's money, it's nothing more or less than an artificially imposed caste system. It's clear he can't go on forever towing Gordon's line. He'll have to engineer a change of heart somehow. Maybe C.P. Gordon can get religion or something. Eddie senses the chair next to him being moved. It's Father Lewis again. He nods at Gordon's papers. A blueprint for a perfect society? Eddie feels, as Gordon, he really ought to put up some kind of defence. It's a very difficult mission we've embarked on, Padre. Obviously, there have to be rules. Yes, have to be rules. Some of your rules, though, seem a little extreme. You think so? Maybe Eddie can start to backtrack on some of Gordon's excesses. Such as, well, the sexual recreation centre bothers me, for instance. Obviously the church would object on the grounds that it's a brothel, plain and simple. Now, I'm a realist. Those who perform those services have chosen to do so. They have that right. Lewis turns to face him. There are tears welling up in his eyes. But how can you? How can any of us commit their children to that life? Eddie doesn't know what to say. Children are to be born into prostitution, Who could possibly defend that? Eddie can't, but he has to say something. Father Lewis, if you disagree with the system here, why did you come? You think a priest plies his trade only amongst the converted? I'm here to change things. I know it won't be easy, but what you've done is the devil's work, and it will be stopped. Eddie doesn't watch the priest go. That bastard Gordon. Where is he now? Probably using his millions to fund compulsory sterilisation camps for the short-sighted. Something starts beeping nearby him. Eddie looks around. Everybody else is looking at him. He's the one who's beeping. He looks down at his jacket. One of his buttons is flashing. Someone at the bench behind him leans back. That's a code orange, Pilgrim. There's a comms booth over there. Eddie looks over to where the man's pointing. He keeps his smile on and hopes for more of a clue. You press the orange button, that's all. He gets to the booth and presses the orange button. A face appears on an LED screen. The security chief, Sticks.
Mr. Gordon, sir. Sorry to bother you.
That's all right, Mr. Sticks. What's the problem?
It's your apartment, sir. It's been trashed, I'm afraid.
I'll be right up. As Eddie gets to the restaurant door, a cramp hits his stomach. That burger was disgusting. Which is something of a shame, because that is the last meal Eddie will ever eat. Mr. Sticks looks up as Eddie steps out of the shuttle cart at the end of the corridor and beckons him into the apartment.
We've reason to believe it was the fugitive who did this.
Eddie steps through the door. The room is destroyed. The furniture is smashed, his clothes are slashed, and even the walls are daubed with hate messages in a strange brown paint. Sticks sees him wondering.
That's blood, sir, from the security guard I allocated to look after you.
Eddie scans the wall. A couple of unpleasant expletives. And above them, daubed madly in blood, I'm coming for you, Eddie.
You know who Eddie might be?
Eddie grunts.
I've already allocated you another apartment, says Sticks. Oh, and by the way, there was a note for you.
Sticks dips into his pocket.
We opened it, I'm afraid, in case it was pertinent to the inquiry.
He hands over a folded blue letter.
We don't think it is. Sorry.
Eddie flips the note open. It's short and very sweet. Meet me in the rose garden. 0100 hours. And it's signed simply P. P? Peck? Ms. Pure Science? There's a huge vegetation zone on the ship to assist oxygen regeneration and supplement the artificial and recycled foodstuff in the crew's diet. Not listed in the brochure, it also provides a perfect setting for a romantic assignation. Eddie pops the note into his breast pocket and heads up the corridor towards the nearest transway station, his thoughts swirling with possible explanations of why the savage Ms. Peck might have had a change of heart. It doesn't occur to Eddie that the letter might be a ruse to get him alone in a deserted place, that it might have been counterfeited by someone who has bad intentions towards him. He's actually whistling a Hoagie Carmichael song as the transway carriage arrives and he steps into it. And that's the last thing he remembers. For a very long time. Eddie's not dreaming. But he's not in reality either. He's in a forest clearing, but the trees aren't entirely convincing. He's lying on a bed of soft foliage. Maybe he should get up, but this is a good place. Unthreatening. His bird song. In his extremely relaxed state, nothing would surprise him. Not even the nymph who's crouching over him. He smiles at her. This seems to please her. The nymph's lips are moving, but her voice isn't quite in sync. Do you know who you are? Of course he knows who he is. He smiles, tries to nod, but he can only incline his head ever so slightly. There's another voice, a male voice.
What did he say?
And a satyr is suddenly crouching next to the nymph. Pointed ears. Furry legs. The whole enchilada. Eddie certainly recognises him. That crew-cutted security hombre. Slick? Stick? No, Sticks. What's he doing in Eddie's heaven? The nymph dismisses the satyr with a small flick of her eyes and turns her attention back to Eddie. Don't panic. You haven't spoken in some considerable time. Just relax and try again. Some considerable time? What could that mean? Eddie tries trawling through the mess of his memory. What exactly was the last thing that happened to him? And his name? He knows his name, he can see it, he just can't recall the actual words. He tries his voice. I'm not sure. I can't quite place my name. Does the name Morton ring a bell? Morton? Piers? Morton? A face swims into Eddie's memory. The medic. Yes, Dr. Morton. Is he here? The response seems to distress the nymph. We hope so, yes. He's you. Eddie mulls that one over. It doesn't sound right at all. His face must be contorted in confusion because the nymph is watching him with concern. All right, let's calm down. What do you remember? I remember... Eddie tries to make connections, but everything's jumbled up. He remembers a strange small city. Fortune? A Fortunado. He remembers something about a big broken window. And a casino. And then staring out high over the planet Earth with the wind whistling through his hair. And there's a ship. The ship. I was on a spaceship. Bingo! Eddie's getting excited now. A big ship. It was called the Willflower. The nymph looks puzzled. It was? The satyr looks puzzled too. The ship has a name? The nymph reaches over his head. Eddie tries to move his head to follow, but can't. She says, I'm going to purge your system. You've been under a fairly strong sedative. This should clear your head. Oh, and you've been plugged into a virtual environment. It's standard procedure after... She looks away. After what you've been through. What has Eddie been through? What happened to me? Are you sure you're ready for this? No. How could I know what it is I'm supposed to be ready for? Good point. Do you remember an accident? No. What kind of accident? We don't know the details. What we do know is you sustained injuries. Eddie looks down at his body. Looks absolutely fine. Of course, he is in a virtual environment, and that might conceivably affect his perception, but everything feels fine. Doesn't seem to be any pain. What kind of injuries? The nymph tries to put on a good news nurse face. Well, on the upside, your head and spinal column were undamaged. And? There is no and. There is no and? My head and my spine? That's all that's left of me? That's all that's left of the original you, but think positive. Those are the important bits. And if it's any consolation, you still have all your hair. Great. I'd hate to feel I was suddenly unattractive. I think you're probably in shock, says the nymph. Look, I know this is a difficult thing to adjust to, and in a perfect world we'd do it more slowly, but there isn't time. How am I alive? You were preserved in some kind of suspension fluid. In a jar. In a jar? Like a pickle? I suppose it is a kind of pickling process. Listen, do you suppose you're ready for me to turn off the artificial environment yet? The nymph is stretching her arm to reach some switch above his head. Wait a minute. Preserved? How long was I preserved? We're not sure. Like everything else on this idiot ship, our dating procedure's kind of screwed up. Approximately. Weeks? Months? Years? Try centuries. Reality bites. The forest warps and collapses in on itself. The birdsong becomes the steady background thrum of a distant engine throb, and Eddie is in the operating theatre. He can see the observation gallery overhead through the diffused glare of the operating lights. The nymph and the satyr are there too, only they're no longer quite so mythical. They're in the vaguely familiar pilgrim uniform, And oddly, very oddly, they're green. Actually, everything's green, and Eddie can't quite put this into words. It's all swirly, sort of. Swishy. Almost as if Eddie's looking at the world through some thick, mucus-like green liquid. A strangely calm shockwave washes over him as the realization comes. He is looking at the world through some thick, mucus-like green liquid. He opens his mouth and wiggles his tongue through gloop. His entire head is encased, submerged in the glutinous green gloop. Obviously there's no point in screaming, but Eddie screams anyway. The scream emerges from a speaker, somewhere around where his breastbone would be if he still had one. The ex-nymph is craning over him greenly. She nods. Let it all out, Piers. I'm well aware this is all new to you, and like I said, in any other circumstances you'd spend weeks in sedation, and we'd wean you off artificiality over several months, but we don't have that luxury. We don't have months. We probably don't have weeks. We need you, Dr. Morton. We need you now. The existence of the entire colony is resting on your shoulders. She looks away again, because, of course, he has no shoulders. But this is something. Eddie is needed. For whatever reason, people are looking to him to save them. An unaccustomed feeling. Okay. Eddie's rallying. My head's in gloop. The big question, can I move? We think so. Try raising your head. Eddie tries, and achieves a very small advance on the horizontal. He strains, and suddenly it works. His neck pivots, and he's looking down the length of what better hadn't be his new body, but almost certainly is. The body he's looking down at is metallic. The torso comprises lateral, tubular hoops that form a kind of oval stretched sphere. The limbs conform to the metallic tubular hoop motif, broken at the joints by what looks like concertinaed rubber. We call it a revival suit, says the un-nymph. Like it? Like it? Eddie stares down. His body's not getting any more appealing. Instead of hands, he has large pincers. This is the best you could do? This represents the pinnacle of centuries of scientific advancement for the finest minds the Earth had to offer? Pincers? Hey, Doctor, I shouldn't have to tell you this, but that is an extremely sophisticated piece of technology you're residing in. Can you imagine the complexities involved in linking that up with all your tiny little nerve endings? Do you have any idea how lucky you are? You're calling me lucky? Certainly. If it weren't for the relentless dedication of a whole bunch of well-intentioned pilgrims, you'd still be a head in a jar. Now, can you move anything besides your neck? I can barely move that. Well, you're restricted by the helmet. Try an extremity, your left foot. Eddie stares at his left foot. It's a rectangular chunk of metal attached to the leg by an ankle of ribbed rubber. He tries to remember the procedure involved in moving a foot. He concentrates hard. He feels something, but the foot doesn't move. He's vaguely aware of a loud, unpleasant sound. Screaming. He flicks his eyes towards the howling. The pincer of his right hand has grabbed hold of Styx's crotch and is squeezing remorselessly. My God, Eddie panics. He tries to relax his right hand and feels his left knee jiggle. I'm sorry, I can't seem... Stop the pain, screams Styx. For the love of God! Oslo, kill the son of a bitch before he snaps them off! With a mighty effort, Eddie wheels his left foot in the opposite direction and the pincers snap open. Styx crumbles to the floor with a terrible groan, nursing his swollen testicles tenderly, as if they were brand-new baby twins. Well, Dr. Morton, says Oslo, the ex-nymph, clearly we have one or two teething problems with your motor functions. Well, yes, in that I've been wired up wrongly, in that my right hand thinks it's my left foot, for example. Don't worry about it. You have to accept a small error margin. Those little nerve endings all look alike. You'll just have to relearn how to use your body. And how long is that supposed to take? Well, best not to rush these things. Oslo touches a control out of Eddie's vision, and the operating bench starts to tilt slowly forward on servos. So, I'm going to give you a full hour. It's closer to 2 hours later by the time Eddie has mastered his new reflexes, with sufficient dexterity not to be designated an actual Grade 1 death threat, and emerges from the operating theatre. He has to concentrate on the tiniest detail of every movement, and the irritable Miss Oslo is not large on patience. So he's travelled some considerable way before he actually notices his surroundings. As far as you can tell, everything looks the same. Green, naturally, but apart from that... Can it be true he's been away for centuries? As he approaches a bend in the corridor, Styx turns around it, heading towards them. This is puzzling, since he has only just left the man in the medical section recovery room, sedated but whimpering. Eddie calls out, confused, "Styx?" And the man stops to look at him.
What the hell are you, Pilgrim?
Styx, it's me, remember?
No. I will from now on, friend. You are somebody's idea of a nightmare. What are you for? Frightening children?
How are your testicles?
My testicles?
Styx lowers his eyeline towards his groin, then slowly raises it back to Eddie. Eddie notices through his green, viscous haze that Styx has a large tattoo in the centre of his forehead. The letter B. Oslo's exasperation breaks the deadlock. "Mr. Styx, carry on." Eddie watches him go. "I don't... They're drones. We've got quite a batch of Styxes. Now get on, Morton." She's dug out some kind of hydraulic forklift trolley. Eddie shuffles up to it. She engages the trolley's motor and steers off at an alarming speed. In a fit of pique, Eddie shouts over the scream of the forklift's motor, "And my name's not Morton!" Oslo cuts the truck's power instantly without warning. Eddie has to grab on with his pincers to stop himself hurtling down the corridor. Even so, he sways precariously. He doesn't know how strong his helmet's faceplate is, or what would happen if it were to smash and release his green gloop all over the floor, but he certainly doesn't feel ready to try it out. He notices his right pincer is bending the strut it's holding, and with a great effort of will, he relaxes the pressure on it. Oslo strides round to face him. "What?" "I've told you already. My name's not Morton, and I'm not a doctor." "Well, who the hell are you, then?" "Ah. The tricky ones first, eh?" Who is he, in fact? He's not who he's supposed to be, twice removed. He's supposed to be Charles Perry Gordon, but he isn't. He's Eddie O'Hare, posing as Charles Perry Gordon, who's somehow become confused with Dr. Piers Morton. The question is, which persona can Eddie viably sustain? So Eddie does what Eddie does best. Eddie dithers. Actually, I'm not completely sure who I absolutely am. I'm just fairly confident that I'm not, in fact, Dr. Morton. Oslo places her palms either side of his helmet, as if she's squeezing his cheeks. "All right, Dr. Morton, I want you to listen to me, because this is life or death important. I'm taking you to meet our psychiatric counsellor. He's going to have to pass you as fit for duty before we can use you. Dr. Morton. So you're going to have to try and act sane, okay? And if you start saying you're someone else who isn't absolutely sure who he absolutely is, I don't think that will go down as an acceptable sanity level, even for this mission." She concludes the diatribe with a short slap of increasing force on the side of Eddie's helmet to punctuate each word. "Are you with me, Dr. Morton?" The final slap results in considerable and disorienting slopping around Eddie's headspace. By the time he's asserted, "All the way, Oslo," the forklift's in motion again and they're heading for the passenger transway. Their destination clearly lies far away. That, or the transway system is functioning at a massively reduced efficiency. Whatever the reason, it's a fair long time before the car stops outside a door. Oslo places her palm on the door pad and steps into the room. Eddie follows her with his best attempt at a confident stride. Not too bad an effort either. He almost completely misses the door frame. A man, presumably the very man Eddie has to impress with his Dr. Mortonism, is seated at a desk, but his concentration is somewhere below table level. Even though Oslo knows he knows she's here, she announces her presence with, "Padre?" The Padre holds up the forefinger of one hand and speaks under the table. "Almost. Nearly. Yeah, go on. Go on. You can. Magnificent. Bless you." He looks up, wearing a beatific smile. The thing where Eddie's heart would be experiences a powerful surge. He recognises the man. Father Lewis. The sensation fades when logic kicks in, and Eddie realises, given that centuries have passed, this can't be the same man, and on closer study, even through the green fug, his features, while similar, are subtly tweaked. This man is a distant descendant of Father Lewis. The Padre pushes his chair back from the desk and smiles at Oslo.
You have our revivee, eh?
That's right. Father Lewis, meet Dr. Piers Morton. The Padre crosses in front of his desk and proffers his hand. There is a small pause as both the priest and Eddie look down at Eddie's wretched pincers, but Father Lewis breaks the embarrassment by grabbing a pincer anyway and shaking it warmly.
How are you feeling, Dr. Morton?
Eddie doesn't know where they're heading, and he has to focus hard on every minute detail of every movement he makes. Nonetheless, he finds some mental space to contemplate his companions. There's a disturbing facial similarity between Oslo and Lewis, mostly around the nose and the high cheekbones. Odd, since the long-gone Mr. Gordon's genetic diversification program was designed to avoid such byproducts of inbreeding, and though there might be a question mark over the Padre's morality, surely Oslo was joking about his hidden cameras. Thankfully, there's no sign of congenital stupidity. Why, then? Is there still no evidence of technological progress? Any human who'd slept for 100 years or more since the 16th century would have awoken to an inexplicable new world. Here, they haven't even changed the direction signs. This observation triggers another. Many of the official signs carry a logo with the ship's name on it. Now, Eddie was seriously drugged up in an artificial reality, but didn't the nymph and the satyr display surprise at the appellation Willflower? Oslo and Father Lewis have stopped, and Lewis is looking querulously at Eddie as if expecting a response. Eddie tries an ambiguous grunt. Lewis sighs and repeats himself. I was saying that this may be a disturbing experience for you, but I think you should face up to it. This is the room in which you've spent your missing decades. I think it might be easier for you to accept your status if you see it for yourself, firsthand. Are you ready? Eddie looks at the sign over the door. Suspended personnel storage. I'm ready, Padre. Lewis swipes his palm over the door sensor and steps into the darkened room. Somebody flicks a switch, and the bright underlight picks out a glowing rank of large glass jars, cylindrical tubes rounding off at the top. The jars are filled with a coloured liquid, and there are heads in the jars. Human heads. This isn't a room you'd want to visit before a big dinner, or just before bedtime, or bluntly, ever. The heads are floating in the liquid, each attached to a crooked spine tapering towards the base of the jar. Lewis is speaking. This was you. Eddie shuffles over. Lewis is pointing out an empty jar labelled Dr. Piers Morton. Eddie scans the jars around it and spots an occupied jar tucked behind his former abode. It's labelled Community Planner Charles Perry Gordon. The head inside is familiar. It's the real Dr. Morton. Eddie should keep this to himself, but he's excited by this first encounter with concrete evidence of his past existence. There! That's me! He tries to point at the jar, but his brain sends out signals that make his left knee shoot up in the air and his right foot twist almost 90 degrees, and this ungainly combination of movements starts his entire body teetering towards the jars. He struggles with his balance, trying to tilt this or that bit of him away from the unthinkable, the unspeakable collision, but it's much too little, much too late, and with a horrible inevitability, he slowly lurches into the helpless heads. When he opens his eyes, the remains of several jar-bound former crew members are scudding across the floor. Mercifully, the containers are sturdy enough to survive the fall. Eddie struggles to his feet. I'm sorry. I got excited. There. He points clumsily, but much less destructively. That's my name. Community Planner Charles Gordon. They labelled the jars wrong. That's Piers Morgan in there. Oslo grabs him either side of his helmet in that way she has. Some part of Eddie that can't possibly exist anymore. He's beginning to find it pleasant. Look, try and get this through your gloop. If you're not Dr. Piers Morton, it's back in the jar. Okay? Back in the jar? Eddie looks at the rank of gawking, grinning heads. I can help? I'm sure I can be of major help. Just tell me what the problem is. Lewis smiles a tight, last rites smile. I'm truly sorry, Charles. We've hit a crisis.
At this point in the mission, we need someone with certain arcane skills we no longer possess.
Medical skills?
Much more arcane than that. We need a person who can interpret the hieroglyphic scrolls, the originals, used to record data.
Hieroglyphic scrolls? Why would a doctor be able to interpret hieroglyphics? Oslo and Lewis look worried now. The priest replies,
We were hopeful that an antiquated medical training program would have included schooling in that obsolete mystery.
Latin are they talking about, or ancient Greek? Do you have an example of these hieroglyphics?
Well, yes.
Lewis sweeps his arm towards the door.
They're everywhere.
Eddie looks at the door. It's a commonplace fire exit. Slowly it dawns on him that Lewis is pointing out nothing more arcane or mysterious than the sign on the door itself. The 8 large letters spelling out fire exit. Somehow, somewhere along the generations, the crew of the Willflower had lost the ability to read. You are talking about the sign on the door, yes? Lewis nods. The sign that says fire exit. Lewis and Oslo look at each other sideways. Lewis takes a step towards him.
Are you telling me that you can interpret those symbols?
Yes, he's lying, says Oslo. He doesn't want to go back in the jar. Eddie looks around the room frantically. See, over there, the sign over the speaker. It says ship com. And there, over that keypad, temperature override. Lewis gets an idea. All right. He turns and picks out one of the jars. Who's this? Eddie reads the label. Lewis passes his palm over it, and the computer confirms Eddie's interpretation. Oslo asks, Do you think we should still try to pass him off as Dr. Morton? Lewis nods.
I think that it might be easier to sell Dr. Morton to the, dissident faction than Charles whatever he was, head of ice cream.
Lewis slaps him on his metal shoulder.
Welcome aboard, Dr. Morton. I'll call a planning meeting right away. It's time you met the rest of the Pilgrim parents. Bernadette, can you get him up to Planning Committee Room 1?
Eddie is unprepared for the emotional punch just the sight of the room packs for him. Planning Committee Room 1, meeting place of the Pilgrim parents. This is really his first encounter with his previous life. The room is apparently unchanged by the passage of time. The polished wooden table, the leather-backed chairs, everything looks as if it's just been unpacked from a delivery truck. Father Lewis is rising to meet him. Eddie looks round the table. Only a handful of people make up the committee, where there used to be dozens. Perhaps this is just an emergency gathering. Father Lewis is introducing him. It's a very big build-up. Eddie wishes he'd tone it down a bit. Then he starts introducing him to the parents. First a woman. Eddie gets that twinge of recognition again. A stern-faced woman whose face is strangely exciting to him, but the recollection doesn't gel until Lewis gives her name.
And this is our science section leader, Trinity Peck.
The likeness is astonishing. She has the ship-high cheekbones, but she has those familiarly ambiguous lips, thin yet full. She has the judgmentally raised right eyebrow. She has the black hair, black as Stalin's soul, scooped back and tucked into some curious headwear. Eddie offers her a fulsome smile. The smile is not reflected. I want you to know from the outset that I am 100% opposed to reviving you in this way. You, sir, are the walking dead, an abomination in the sight of God, and the demon spawn of Satan. Well, the old Peck charm's still alive and kicking. Lewis leads him up the table.
I think you've already met some copies of our security leader, Apton Styx.
Another of the Styx drones rises to greet him. This one has an A burned into his forehead. He holds out his hand. The drone's smile is so warm and genuine, and the collective disdain for him around the room is so palpable, Eddie feels he should make some kind of friendly gesture. Without sufficient concentration, he reaches out to shake the proffered hand, engages the wrong impulses, and slaps the hapless Styx with astonishing sudden violence, sending him careening across the table to crash, unconscious, into a group of empty chairs stacked up against the wall. Nobody even tries to help him. He's a drone, less than human. At the head of the table is a young adolescent, unkempt, unwashed, with a thick fringe of greasy hair obscuring the right three-quarters of his otherwise pimple-patterned face. His filthy sneakers are crossed on the table, and he's peeling away bits of rubber from the toe caps. Surely Lewis can't be introducing this specimen as the leader of the mission. Yet he looks up at the epithet captain. He forms his right hand into a mock gun and mimics firing it at Eddie, accompanying the action with a sound made with his cheek. Blown away, Pilgrim. Let's skip the whole handshake scenario. Okay, Vitch? You're the captain? The youth grins. Yes, indeedy peedy. The lad is what? 30? 40? I don't mean to be rude, but aren't you a little young for a mission commander? Oslo steps in with a hint of glee. Actually, he's a little young for solid food, but as you are doubtless aware, our positions are designated on a strictly hereditary basis, thanks to the brilliant goo brain who planned this operation, and Captain Gwent's father rather selfishly died a couple of weeks ago before his son and heir was thoroughly toilet-trained. But there were contingencies for this kind of eventuality. Eddie tries to dredge his memory. Shouldn't someone take over temporarily? Provisions were made. Oslo stands and thumps the table. Can't you find out? It must be recorded somewhere in the writings. It'll be in the ship's charter, which, of course, will be preserved in the central computer, and you don't have to be able to read to communicate with the computer, so why don't they know this? Don't they talk to the computer? Is that skill now derelict? How can Eddie find this out without devaluing his usefulness? The ship's charter? Says Oslo. Where's the ship's charter? Oslo's desperation is beginning to look embarrassing. Whoa, hey! The lad sweeps his filthy footwear off the table. Take 20 in a soothe booth, lady. If you want to start mutiny odds, you can do it in your own, say, leisure time. Capiche? Thank you, Captain. Now, may I start this briefing? Oslo puts her knuckles on the table and cranes over. 17 days ago, there was a major accident. We assumed some kind of asteroid strike that ripped away 2/3 of the ship's main engines. As far as we can tell, at least 80% of the manoeuvring thrusters were destroyed too. The entire ship seems to be damaged to the point where it's ripping itself apart bit by bit. Given we now have minimal manoeuvrability, our only slim chance of survival is to somehow work our way into the orbit of a vaguely habitable planet in the local region and establish the colony there. Oslo passes her hand over the tabletop, and a detailed, animated three-dimensional display of the local planetary system appears in the air above it. Okay, we have 3 candidates for settlement, of which this would be the best option. She leans over and points out one of the smaller orbs. The planet our good captain has christened, with characteristic maturity, it offers the best prospect of a breathable atmosphere, plentiful water, and consumable vegetation. The downside with a docking is our best calculations give us a 0 probability of effecting an orbit. Our second favourite is this monster. Oslo indicates a large, unwelcoming globe. Most of its surface is obscured by thick, volatile swirls of black cloud formations, interrupted by occasional disturbing blasts of bright orange explosions. The planet Penis. Way short of perfect, atmospherically, massive extremes of temperature, evidence of volcanic activity on a stupendous scale. Technically, we just might be able to settle there, though we'd have to erect some form of enormous geodesic shelter during the establishment phase. The outsider, she gestures towards a much smaller orb, spinning far too fast and far too close to the system star for Eddie's liking, is the planet Panties. This one gives us our best shot of a rendezvous, but there's nothing even approaching a breathable atmosphere. Extremes of temperature that would freeze mercury on the one side and melt gold on the other, and a global dust storm that won't subside for another 20,000 years. So, Captain Gwent stands and flicks back his hair with a nod of his head. Eddie swears he can hear the grease particles collide against the wall behind him. To say, recap, what you're saying, Oslo, is a no-no. You think we've got a 50-50 chance of encircling Penis, though it may erupt, but with a good hard thrust, we could almost certainly get into Panties. He leers a brace-toothed grin in Eddie's direction. What think you, Dr. Morton? What does Eddie think? Eddie thinks he died and went to juvenile hell.